The new spotlight on White House counsel Don McGahn and what exactly he's told Bob Mueller about key moments that could form an obstruction case. McGahn today ignored reporters' questions about his conversations with Mueller.
Why did you speak so long to the special counsel, Mr. McGahn?
Did you comply because you thought the president would betray you?
Do you regret that decision?
Those questions after the New York Times revealed that McGahn spoke to Mueller's team for 30 hours. Trump's lawyers have a limited account of what he says, which they only realized after the New York Times reported on his interviews this weekend. The White House is going into damage control. Trump tweeting that he'd allowed McGahn to testify and insisting he's not, quote, a John Dean type rat. Rudy Giuliani downplayed the whole story.
We have a good sense, obviously, of what Mr. McGahn testified to.
So you don't know what Mr. McGahn, you don't know 100% of what he testified to Mr. Mueller?
I think that through John Dowd, we have a pretty good sense of it.
But McGahn was reportedly worried that Trump was setting him up to take a fall for any potential wrongdoing. So he decided to be completely open and told investigators about some events they didn't already know about, like Trump's efforts to fire Mueller. All that as Giuliani continued to push back against Trump testifying and went viral with this moment.
I'm not going to be rushed into having him testify so that he gets trapped into perjury. And when you tell me that, he should testify because he's going to tell the truth and he shouldn't worry, well, that's so silly because it's somebody's version of the truth, not the truth. He didn't have a conversation.
Truth is truth. I don't mean to go like...
No, it isn't truth. Truth isn't truth. The President of the United States says, I didn't...
Truth isn't truth. Mr. Mayor, do you realize what...
No.
This is going to become a bad meme.
Don't do this to me.
Don't do truth as a truth to me.
In a moment, I'm going to speak with Texas Congressman Joaquin Castro, who serves on the House Intelligence Committee. But we begin with Maya Wiley, former counsel to the mayor of New York City and former federal prosecutor John Flannery. I should be clear, Maya, you were not former counsel to that former mayor of New York City. But that really, we've crossed a line into, well into weird at this point. Truth is not the truth.
All I keep thinking is if this is your attorney that you're treating as your spin doctor,
right? He's not
maybe
doing either
what
of those
you
well.
Need is a shrink.
Yeah, it's
because
very strange.
This is really not good lawyering. We have to remember a couple things about Rudy Giuliani. I really mean it when I say he's been much more of a spin doctor than a lawyer. He's not spinning well,
right?
But he's really been out there as the front person to essentially lay out the arguments that the Trump administration wants the American people to believe, not so much what he wants the prosecutors to believe.
Right.
So he's really signaling to the people, even though Donald Trump has said repeatedly that he wants to talk to Mueller, that he wants to participate in the interview, and that he has been cooperative, that nonetheless he won't do it. But the reason is because he will be trapped in perjury, which is a really bizarre legal argument to make.
Right.
Because you can't be trapped in perjury if you're not perjuring yourself.
Right.
You can have a dispute about what the facts are, meaning you can have Comey saying one thing and Donald Trump saying something differently. That in and of itself is not perjury.
Right.
So to use that as an argument to say my client will be somehow trapped is simply not legally supportable. But I will say one thing. Giuliani was actually telling the truth when he said the truth is not the truth, because he has not been telling it very frequently.
John, let's talk about the Trump administration, or Donald Trump's lawyers, really seeming to be caught off guard by the extent to which Don McGahn spoke to the prosecutor, special prosecutor. Here's a quote from the New York Times. It says, Mr. Trump was rattled by the Times report. The president, who's said to be obsessed with the role that John W. Dean, the White House counsel to President Richard M. Nixon, played as an informant during Watergate, was jolted by the notion that he did not know what Mr. McGahn had shared. Explain to me how this works. The president did not invoke executive privilege. He said that he allowed Don McGahn to speak. The same article speaks about the fact that Don McGahn and his lawyer thought the president was going to throw him under the bus. So he thought it best to get out ahead of this thing and tell Mueller what he knows.
Well, I don't know that there was any executive privilege that applied here. And the thing about the attorney-client privilege, if you will, is he represents the office of the president. And I can't, not the individual,
Correct.
Mr. Trump, who's dishonoring that office. And I think that his obligation would be to protect the office by disclosing what he knew. For instance, Yates came to him from the acting AG and said, Flynn has committed a crime. You should know that. Did he pass that on to Trump? Also, we had meetings that violated the investigative protocol. For example, Jared Kushner would sit with Trump, and McGahn objected to that. Also, McGahn was put in a very difficult position because Trump, when he went to fire Comey, consulted with McGahn, and finally, and I'm sure there are more instances, but McGahn was asked to fire Mueller. I think that could take 30 hours. And that these guys can't figure out what he would be talking about is beyond belief. Edward Bennett Williams used to say that if you're a litigator, you can't be a good litigator unless you got a strong butt. And it looks like, I don't know if Giuliani has aphasia or he just doesn't have the energy to work and study the facts.
Right.
But he's like an assist to the prosecution and to the world understanding that there's a transparency right to Trump telling us lies on a daily basis. It's no surprising that he doesn't know what truth is. Somewhere along in his life, truth went this way and he went that way.
No kidding.
And it's evident in every performance that he makes on behalf of Trump.
He's got a new one, Maya, and maybe he was listening to you because Donald Trump has just spoken with Reuters, and he was asked, I just want to give you a few of the things he said, asked if he would take away Mueller's security clearance, says he hasn't given it a lot of thought. That wasn't a no. It's I haven't given a lot of thought. It's also reported that he declined to say whether he would do an interview with Mueller's team. He said that speaking to Mueller's investigators in the Russia probe could be, as you said, a perjury trap. And finally, here's the icing on the cake, John. I hope you're listening to this one.
I am.
Donald Trump says he stayed out of the Mueller probe, but doesn't have to, and says he could run it if he wanted to.
Oh, that's interesting.
That is definitely interesting.
Yes,
Yeah.
the person who's being investigated for potentially violating the law, running the investigation about whether he violated the law, would really be, I'd say,
That'd be unique, right?
unprecedented.
Let's bring in the
It's an
legislator who's
impeachable-
on the panel here. I want to bring in Congressman Joaquin Castro, who is a Democrat of Texas. He's on the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, this is highly problematic because people went from thinking that the president's behavior with respect to John Brennan was punitive, it was petty, it was vindictive. It's actually more important than that because if the president is talking about the exercise of king-like powers, he's just crossed a line here and said, I could run the investigation into myself if I wanted to. That sends a chill down our Republican spines.
Yeah, I mean, the rhetoric itself for a democracy is scary. But those words better just stay as words and rhetoric, and the president better not make a single move to fire Bob Mueller. And if he does, the Congress should move immediately to impeach the president of the United States.
Congressman, when you're hearing this stuff, I mean, I really have to, for people who maybe don't follow it that closely, they're not really understanding where this is going. The fact that this is just getting more and more serious every day. Last week, the president needed to change the narrative off of Omarosa, so he goes with this John Brennan thing, which was dated July 26. So he waited 3 weeks to do that. He's got a bag of tricks that are meant to be distracting Americans, but increasingly we're now talking about things in which he's working around established principles and established norms. At some point, where do American people look for relief?
Well, I mean, the ultimate answer is the November 2018 election, the midterm election. That is the ultimate antidote to what we're seeing from Donald Trump. You've got to elect a Democratic House of Representatives and a Democratic Congress that can be a check on this president.
John, what do you make of these comments that the president's just made?
What I make of them is that he is actually not living up to his oath. He speaks as if any individual power he has is limitless, when in fact he is circumscribed by the law and the Constitution. So, for instance, if he's making self-serving judgments and he's firing people investigating him, he is violating a fundamental notion of due process. A person can't be a judge in his own matter. A person can't be in charge of his own investigation. It's a basic principle that goes back to merry old England, and it's impeachable among all the other things that he's done. And what he's done within the Justice Department already to try to undermine the credibility of people who are his accusers or investigators, it just puts him in the jackpot seat for impeachment. I would hope that we would indict him instead. The obstruction is transparent, and there may be more that Mueller has that proves even many more things. And I think it's ironic that, unlike John Dean, McGahn is no rat. McGahn is an honest man. And John Dean would be the first to say that he had implicated himself. But McGahn has done everything he could and thereby made him a good witness by the fact that he did not involve himself in the cover-up and the crime. He resisted it.
McGahn has stated that his work is representing the presidency and not the president, Maya. Sure. But again, Donald Trump tweeted today calling the Mueller team thugs. He has discredited or attempted to discredit Bob Mueller. He keeps talking about this angry group of Democratic thugs. At some point, Maya, the president's poll numbers aren't moving down, despite the increasingly desperate moves, the sense that he's getting cornered into this White House. What do you make of it?
I make a couple of things of it. One is there are some Americans who are watching regularly and constantly all the news that is coming forward without regard to what position they have, and watching very closely every step of this process. There are many Americans who are just going along with their lives, trying to get through their day-to-day, trying to save their houses or earn enough money to put their kids through school, who simply are not watching all the facts unfold, are hearing a lot of rhetoric on a lot of different sides, and are simply saying, I'm overloaded, I think this is sensationalistic, I want to wait and see. And that doesn't mean that's where they will stay. That is not where they will stay. But I think that we have to really understand that not all of us get our information from all the same sources. Yeah. We're not paying attention to it in all the same ways. I suspect that will change as we get some definitive answers out of this investigation, rather than sitting and speculating like many of us must, because we don't have all the facts that Robert Mueller and his team has.
We've got the top of that iceberg.
We've got the top of that iceberg. I think everything that's been said on this program is incredibly important about our norms, but that's a very abstract concept to a lot of people who are just trying to make it through.
John Brennan's security clearance is an abstract concept to a lot of people. They don't know what he does with it.
They don't know what it means, right?
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.